To begin, is this too loud or okay? To begin, I want to thank Caleb for his kind and generous words, and I also want to thank Caleb for setting up this event as a whole. It's really good that people who share our views, who are so far and few, are able to gather in one place. I mean, the security threats to the conference were absolutely unbelievable. I mean, there's so few of us, and yet we pose such a profound threat to the status quo and to the established left. And on that note, the topic of my presentation is actually going to be about the left, because to me, I don't see the Center for Political Innovation or Infared or other currents as simply a type of leftist with more adjectives. I think what we are witnessing is a more fundamental political realignment, both in this country and even throughout the world. So to start, I want to give a little background information about what Infared is and what the project was supposed to be about from the very beginning. A lot of you may know me because of my YouTube or Twitch streams or of my infamous shenanigans, so to speak, whether it's on YouTube or Twitter and other ways in which I've been able to gain exposure. But as far as the Infared project is concerned, as far as the Infared collective is concerned, this has actually been something that's been in the works for many, many years, beginning somewhere around the time of before the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And the thing, I guess the singular point of distinction of our collective of like-minded people is that we wanted to resign ourselves to actually to learn about what the essence of Marxism, what the essence of even leftism really was before we were going to put ourselves out there and participate in the discourse. And throughout the years and throughout the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump, we came to realize that what is known as the left in America and in the United States is not simply infiltrated with bad elements. It's not even simply led by bad elements. There is something fundamentally rotten to the core about leftism in this country in a way that can't be resolved simply by becoming a better type of leftist. So, but at the same time, we also rejected the notion that we could somehow be outside of the antagonism that gives rise to the distinction between the right and the left. In a sense, when we did decide to go public, posting our videos and eventually going live, our entrance into the public sphere was, from the very outset, a declaration of war against the American left. And naturally, we've received the response from leftists that we are just secretly Nazis or secretly fascists or neo-Nazis, simply disguising ourselves as leftists. The only thing I can say in response to that is that I am very much disappointed in the stunning lack of imagination on part of our enemies and opponents. Because as far as Infared's real and authentic commitments behind these so-called super fights is something far worse, far more terrifying, far more cancelable, far more problematic than these leftists could ever even imagine or comprehend. And that is very simply a concrete articulation of Marxism-Leninism in the 20th century, which, as we're witnessing in the events in Ukraine, we're starting to see are considered worse by the American left than neo-Nazism and fascism in the 20th century. Fascism, as a matter of fact, in the United States is even more misunderstood than we are. The so-called anti-fascists don't actually oppose fascism as it existed in the 20s and the 30s. They're just not familiar with it, just like they're not familiar with socialism or communism and the things that they currently identify with. But all of us here pretty much already know that. I mean, being here and being part of the Center for Political Innovation, that is already a sign you're familiar with this. What we have to ask and we have to start questioning is, why is this? Why do we have this kind of topsy-turvy situation where it seems like left is right and up is down and the world's been turned upside down, so to speak? I think we should inquire to the very beginning into the origins of the so-called left. The left-right distinction has its origins in the French Revolution, when the supporters of the king, supposedly, and the supporters of the established order and religion and the so-called ancien regime decided to distinguish themselves and kind of group together to protect themselves against the wild outbursts and sloganeering and phrase-mongering and so on of the supporters of the revolution. But even from the very beginning, not just here in America, this distinction was deceptive, because by the time the French Revolution had already been underway, one could not possibly associate the so-called ancien regime with any kind of old order. The changes brought about by modern capitalism had already fundamentally transformed not only the economic base of Europe, but also in a very kind of sinister and hidden way, the political superstructure. I mean, the aristocrats and the monarchs of Europe at the time, I know this is a generalization, but they were cynics. They were not, these traditional, conservative, religious people. They engaged in all manner of kind of debauchery and even atheism. And I mean, Voltaire was welcomed into the courts of the monarchs and sovereigns of Europe at the time. So we see a very paradoxical and strange situation from the very outset, where the defenders of order actually represent chaos. Now, as for chaos and change and turbulence and basically the opposite. As for the left and its kind of wild enthusiasm for the revolution, I think what we can see as a broad trend, as far as leftism is concerned, is just a kind of naked reflection of that. Leftism, let's face it, stands for something kind of sinister and malign, right? We kind of associate left with kind of a wayward path and a wayward turn. And that was certainly true at the very beginning. Leftists represented this kind of desire to change and have a revolution and overthrow everything that everyone had already been used to for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, leftism today is associated with the turmoil of sexuality and family life and culture and even, everything you can think of. It just represents this fundamental force of alienation. But what represents, as far as Marxism is concerned, a level of continuity with that, is that among those kind of wild leftists who were there calling for the revolution, you had people like Robespierre. And Robespierre and his faction specifically, they're typically associated in the kind of popular imagination of being like these left-wing fanatics and so on and so on. But interestingly, we see with Robespierre, on the one hand, the calling for a revolution, the need for a revolution, and acceptance of the fact that the so-called ancien regime had already debased itself. It's not that leftists need to come and simply change things and overthrow things. This old order has already delegitimized itself. And with Robespierre, we see a commitment to return to some kind of semblance of basic, and when I say basic, I mean in the sense of fundamental humanity. Robespierre, with his notion of the Republic of Virtue and his insistence on the existence of an indivisible deity, a god, as opposed to the ultra-leftists at the time, who represented a complete, full-on campaign for de-Christianization. Robespierre was not a right-winger. He didn't represent some kind of reactionary attempt to return to the old order. But at the same time, he did not share with the so-called leftists of his time a kind of perverse, full identification with the changes that were at hand. the changes that give rise to leftism are not necessarily good. They're not necessarily things that are to be celebrated in a one-sided way. They also correspond to a kind of profound tragedy. It is a tragedy that, you know, a king who's supposed to represent his subjects turns out to be corrupt. It is a tragedy that the institutions of religion, which are meant to represent one thing, actually exist in actual reality in a entirely opposite way. I mean, this is the fundamental alienation described by Marx and Engels when they say that all that is holy is profaned and that all that is solid is turned into air. What they're really talking about is the process by which a world that used to be familiar to human beings becomes entirely alien. As far as the continuity of leftism is concerned, however, what we can gather from this kind of scene of the right and the left in the initial stages of the revolution is really two sides of the same coin. Somehow, on the one hand, the hypocrisy of the right and the fanaticism of the left, on the other hand, completely supplement one another. The leftists merely openly exhibit and embrace perversely the evil that the right-wingers disguise. I mean, you see the same thing in the United States. Our so-called conservative politicians here, we come to see, are anything but conservative. They have all manner of hidden pathologies and perversions and so on and so on, often in ways that very much flatter the leftists, right? So as far as this paradox is concerned, Marxism, and specifically Marxism-Leninism, has a privileged significance in being able to resolve in the form of what is called the dialectic or dialectic thinking, which avoids one-sided conclusions. I actually don't necessarily agree with the view that Marxism-Leninism is not, or communism is not inevitably left-wing. I think inevitably it is left-wing. I think the correct course, right, that is steered by the great helmsmen, right, whether it's Stalin or Mao or other leaders of the communist movement in the past, they are, when they're going straight, they're also going in a left-wing direction. So deviations, left-wing deviations and right-wing deviations are actually the same in the sense of deviating from this fundamental course. The problem with leftism is not that it represents change or revolution or some kind of movement. The problem of leftism is that it attempts to reify, attempts to kind of take a snapshot of what this is and dogmatically identify with that to the point of becoming its exact opposite. Stalin was famously posed with the question of which is worse, the right or the left deviation. And to that Stalin said, both. They're both worse in regards to the main line and the main course. And for Stalin and for Marxists and for Marxist-Leninists, there is a kind of real path of development that proceeds independently of our will and independently of what we want it to be or what we think it should be or what we ideologically represent as. And this is a path of development, it is a path of change, which I suppose inevitably makes it left-wing. In China today, with the rise of Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping thought, China is embarking on a leftward turn, but it's not doing so in a leftist manner. It's remaining resolute in its commitment to the original founding principles of the Communist Party and to the thinking of Mao and Deng Xiaoping and so on, in order to maintain a steady and stable line of development. I think one of the problems we see today in America when it comes to leftism, speaking socially, is that I look back to when I myself became initiated as a kind of leftist. And what I realized is that no one is spontaneously ever a kind of leftist, right? Spontaneously, we entertain all manner of problematic conspiracy theories and prejudices and wild views of the world. I mean, do shape-shifting lizard people rule us? I mean, it's all really up in the air, right? Leftism is actually something you have to be initiated into. You have to reflexively become a leftist. I mean, you have to adopt it as a kind of reflexivity. And with that, we're witnessing this kind of impasse in American politics, where on the one hand, all authentic and spontaneous manifestations of opposition to the status quo are, regardless of their actual content, viewed as fundamentally right-wing. And on the other hand, increasingly, the most naked and shameless kind of defense of the status quo is leftist. I mean, the left in the United States, it went from rage against the machine to support the vaccination mandates. I mean, it's absolutely incredible, right? But the reason this has happened is, again, the same reason for the dialectic development of politics that has defined the Western world since the French Revolution. It's for the same reason that the first counter-revolutionaries were never actually reactionaries or rightists. They've always been leftists. During the October Revolution in Russia, we should remember that some of the fiercest opposition faced by the Bolsheviks came from the so-called left, and even came from their left. People like to dismiss Lenin's left-wing infantilism, his book, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, as some kind of, he's just talking about the ultra-leftists and let's just not be too extreme. But Lenin was actually talking about a very fundamental problem in Western Europe of the way in which people were articulating the significance of the October Revolution as simply meaning that we have to be to the left of the Social Democrats. And the entire political spectrum is not necessarily false in its content, it's just false in its form. There is a fundamental distinction between left and right that I think is real, and that can't, the third positionists of the 20s who simply said neither left nor right, but whatever in between or a fusion. I think this is basically an attempt to deny a fundamental political antagonism. But on the other hand, the form in which this antagonism takes inevitably enters into contradiction with its content. So we're witnessing a time, in this country specifically, in which those who are committed to what Caleb refers to as the movement, right, of the left, are inevitably going to arrive at a completely opposite position. I mean, we joke about it, but we are really entering a period in which we should expect the so-called radical left to slowly and begin to entertain some form of Nazism or rehabilitation of Nazism. We're seeing the first stages of something like that in Ukraine. I mean, we have been hammered home so much about this stuff about decolonization and this stuff about critiquing white people or whatever and Europeans. Here you have a situation of all of the guilty world, right, Europe, uniting under the banner of NATO against Russia, which is a semi-Asiatic country to the east. I mean, the irony is incredible. So the leftists, the same ones that have been telling us for so long that, the problem is uniquely some kind of European guilt, are rallying behind a kind of pan-European supremacist renaissance, a revival of neo-Nazism basically, against Russia and now also against China. I mean, it's not simply an irony. We should draw a fundamental conclusion from this. And for me, that conclusion is that the so-called American left in its entirety cannot be redeemed whatsoever. It's not simply that we can build something from scratch, but we should cease to see leftists as a reservoir from which we should attempt to draw support. The support for anyone who's interested in a real initiative to oppose the status quo is going to come from people who are either apolitical or who are right-wing. But as far as leftists are concerned, I say we owe them nothing. We owe them absolutely no attention. We have no reason to pander to them or to sacrifice our language or the manner of the way in which we present ourselves to them. We should stop walking on eggshells around them. We don't need this acute minority of parasites on the working people of this country. You know, as a kind of closing remark, a lot of people have a kind of deceptive view that we are just ideological, we adopt these ideologies and these political orientations from scratch. I mean, leftists are leftists because they're committed to a certain set of principles, and rightists are rightists because they're, I guess, metaphysically evil, demons. I don't know. I mean, you have the Jabba, not to spoil the mood by mentioning Jabba the Vosh. He talks about the so-called Nazbol vortex, clearly evoking this idea that leftists are people who have to be neurotic and we have to kind of hold to our principles, and that if we let go, we're going to fall into this kind of primordial vortex of original sin or something like that, right? But the thing is that most often, in every revolution in the history of modern humanity, I guess dating from the French Revolution or even earlier, or the English Civil War, depending on how you want to look at it, the reason why the revolutionaries who first initiated the revolutionary action are the first to turn on the revolution is because the meaning of change and revolution or leftism or communism comes to prove itself to be something entirely different to what they expected it to be. And I'm not saying that in the sense of George Orwell's Animal Farm, where they were expecting the utopia and they got a different result. It's a basic class analysis. People become leftists because they're embittered Democrats, right? They were trying to climb the career and become these new kind of interns for, I don't know, Nancy Pelosi or something, or Joe Biden, I don't know, Obama, whatever. And then for some reason they get embittered and they get kicked out, so they just want to be a little more extreme, right? They primarily begin from urbanized and educated backgrounds, and leftism is this kind of form of enlightenment and kind of allows them to express their class position in a way that is raised over the general and broad strata. And once the actual meaning of this kind of theories and ideologies that they thought were the key to be able to kind of uplift themselves as a class become really weaponized by the countryside and by the broad strata, they come to realize that, well, this wasn't what I signed up for. I mean, they didn't expect during the October Revolution the union of the workers and peasants to actually mean that that's 90% of the population of Russia was actually going to rise up and take up arms, and all of its spontaneity and authentic peasant vigor and vulgarity, I should say. They weren't expecting that in Iran when the urbanized middle classes and intellectuals of the cities who were shouting slogans of revolution and even some Maoist people's war, and, well, you wanted people's war, here are the people. It's not really what you expected. The same thing happened in China during the Cultural Revolution, when the urbanized and educated youth in the cities didn't realize, and this is all a kind of Shakespearean dialectical irony, that I think Marxism-Leninism is uniquely equipped as a very index of the historical experience of this kind of contradictions is able to allow us to navigate and ultimately overcome as an ideological confusion. So with that, I just wanted to say this final closing remark. Thank you so much, Caleb, for having me, and thank you everyone here for coming out and showing support for the Center for Political Innovation.